The first transmission came at 14:37 hours, crackling through static like broken glass. Mayday, Mayday, Warthog 77 down, coordinates November Delta 472. Then nothing. Silence stretched across the radio frequencies while search and rescue teams scrambled from 3 different bases, their rotors already spinning before the transmission ended. But what they found 47 minutes later would haunt every pilot who heard the story for the rest of their careers. The wreckage should have been scattered across 17 square miles of Afghan mountainside, should have been twisted metal and smoke, another statistic in a war that had already claimed too many. Instead, ground teams discovered something impossible: tire tracks in the desert sand, leading away from what appeared to be a controlled landing site. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, call sign Warthog 77, had vanished without a trace. Major Cassandra Phoenix Thorne had earned her call sign the hard way, rising from ashes others thought would bury her forever. 3 tour, 47 combat missions, and a reputation for bringing damaged aircraft home when everyone else would have ejected. The brass called her reckless. Her wingmen called her magic. But on this scorching afternoon in September, even Phoenix seemed to have run out of miracles. "Control, we've got debris field negative, repeat negative," reported rescue leader, his voice tight with confusion. "Requesting expanded search parameters. This doesn't make sense." What didn't make sense was how a 30,000-pound aircraft could simply disappear. What didn't make sense was the single boot print they found pressed into the sand near what looked like landing marks. Size 7, military issue, with the distinctive tread pattern of standard Air Force boots. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb stood in the Tactical Operations Center, staring at the empty radar screen where Phoenix's transponder had blinked its final message. He'd been her squadron commander for 18 months, long enough to know that Cassandra Thorne didn't quit, didn't surrender, didn't die quietly in some godforsaken valley without taking half the enemy with her. The woman had earned her Silver Star by flying a shot-up A-10 home with one engine gone and hydraulics failing, landing on foam with smoke pouring from her aircraft. "Sir," the communications specialist called out, her young voice cutting through the tension. "We're getting intermittent pings from 77's emergency beacon. Signal's weak and mobile, looks like it's moving north." Webb felt his jaw tighten. Moving meant alive. Moving meant Phoenix was still fighting, still flying, still defying every law of physics and common sense that should have put her in the ground an hour ago. Outside, the desert wind howled like the ghosts of every pilot who never made it home. The A-10 Thunderbolt II was built to take punishment. Designed around the massive GAU-8 Avenger cannon, the aircraft could absorb damage that would cripple any other fighter. But even the legendary Warthog had limits, and Phoenix had found every single one of them during her engagement with enemy forces in the Toragar Mountains. 3 surface-to-air missiles had tracked her through the narrow valley, their contrails painting white lines against the cloudless sky like the signatures of death itself. She'd evaded the first 2 with a combination of chaff, flares, and maneuvers that pulled 6 GS and left her seeing stars. The third missile had been different, smarter, more patient. It waited until she'd committed to her gun run against the Taliban compound below, waited until she was low and slow, and focused on the targets that were firing at American ground troops pinned down in the valley floor. The explosion took out her left engine and shredded half her tail section. Warning lights bathed the cockpit in angry red as hydraulic fluid sprayed like arterial blood across her canopy. Phoenix felt the stick go mushy in her hands, felt the aircraft trying to roll inverted and dive into the mountainside 800 feet below. This was the moment when training separated pilots from passengers, when years of preparation condensed into split-second decisions that meant the difference between going home and becoming another memorial plaque. "Phoenix, Phoenix, you're trailing smoke," came the voice of her wingman, Captain Riley Torch Morrison. His F-16 prowled above her like a guardian angel with afterburners, but there wasn't much he could do except watch her fight for her life. "Status report, Phoenix. You copy?" "Copy, Torch," she replied, her voice steady despite the chaos filling her cockpit. Lost the left mill, hydraulics are shot to hell, but I've still got one good engine and about half a tail. That's more than some people land with. Her hands moved across the instruments with practiced precision, shutting down damaged systems and rerouting power to whatever still worked. The A-10 might be ugly, but it was built by people who understood that pilots needed options when everything went wrong. The terrain below offered nothing but rocks and regret. No roads, no flat spaces, nothing that looked remotely like somewhere a 30,000-pound aircraft could touch down and walk away. Phoenix banked right, following the valley eastward toward more promising ground, her good engine whining under maximum power while warning buzzers reminded her that she was flying a machine that should have been falling apart. That's when she saw it, a straight section of desert floor, maybe 2 miles long and relatively flat. It would have to be enough. The emergency landing checklist was burned into Phoenix's memory from countless hours in simulators, but theory became brutally real when the desert floor rushed up to meet her wounded warthog. She'd lowered her landing gear despite the screaming warnings about hydraulic failure. Hopping the massive tires would absorb some impact even if the brakes didn't work. The touchdown came hard and fast, 60 knots faster than she'd ever attempted before, the aircraft bouncing twice before settling into a controlled skid across the hardpan. Dust and debris filled the air like a sandstorm as Phoenix rode the beast to a stop, her hands locked on the useless stick while momentum slowly bled away. When the aircraft finally shuddered to a halt, she sat in absolute silence for nearly 30 seconds, listening to the tick of cooling metal and her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. She was alive. The warthog was intact. Against all probability and several laws of physics, they had both survived. "Phoenix, Phoenix, report your status," Torch's voice crackled through her headset, tight with concern. "I've got you on the ground, but I can't see movement in the cockpit." "Still breathing, Torch," she replied, already running her hands over the instrument panel to assess damage. "Aircraft's hurt but not broken. Give me 2 minutes to check systems." What she found wasn't encouraging. The left engine was completely dead, victim to shrapnel and fire. Her right engine showed temperature warnings that meant she was running on borrowed time. Hydraulics were gone, meaning no flaps, no normal braking, and questionable control authority. But the radios worked, and her emergency beacon was transmitting. Most importantly, she could still see Taliban fighters moving through the mountains barely 3 miles away. American ground forces were still pinned down in that valley, still taking fire, still counting on air support that had just been reduced by half. Phoenix studied her tactical display, calculating distances and ammunition loads while her right engine slowly cooked itself in the desert heat. "Control, this is Phoenix," she transmitted on the emergency frequency. "I'm down but operational, requesting immediate tactical assessment of friendlies in Sector 7 Alpha." The response came back within seconds. 12 American soldiers trapped in a compound, surrounded by approximately 40 enemy fighters, medical evacuation impossible until the area was secured. Phoenix looked at her fuel gauge, then at her ammunition counter. She had perhaps 20 minutes of flying time left in her wounded bird, and enough 30 rounds for one more gun run. The engine restart sequence wasn't supposed to work with a damaged turbine, but Phoenix had never been one to follow the rules when lives were on the line. She nursed the throttle forward slowly, feeling the warthog shudder as the good engine spooled up while the dead one remained silent. The aircraft wanted to pull left constantly, requiring constant pressure on the rudder pedals, but it moved. Damaged, limping, but still capable of delivering the kind of close air support that made the difference between soldiers going home and soldiers becoming statistics. "Phoenix, what are you doing?" Torch's voice carried a note of disbelief as he watched her taxi toward the makeshift runway she'd created with her emergency landing. "You can't seriously be thinking of taking off again." "Copy that concern, Torch, but we've got Americans in contact 3 miles north of my position," Phoenix replied, checking her weapon systems one final time. The GAU-8 cannon showed green across all indicators, its 7 barrels still capable of spitting 30mm death at 4,000 rounds per minute. I didn't come this far to leave the job half-finished. The takeoff roll required every inch of her improvised runway, and more luck than any pilot should count on. The asymmetric thrust from her single engine tried to push the aircraft into a ground loop, while the lack of hydraulic pressure meant she was flying by pure muscle and instinct. But the A-10 had been designed by people who understood that sometimes pilots needed to attempt impossible things, and gradually, grudgingly, the wounded warthog clawed its way back into the air. Phoenix kept the aircraft low, barely 50 feet above the desert floor, partly to avoid being spotted by enemy forces, but mostly because she wasn't sure her damaged bird could handle much altitude. The terrain rushed past her canopy in a blur of tan and brown, broken only by the occasional rocky outcrop or dried riverbed. Her fuel gauge showed critical levels, meaning she had one chance to make this work. The Taliban compound appeared ahead, exactly where intelligence had indicated, a cluster of mud brick buildings surrounded by fighting positions that sparkled with muzzle flashes. Phoenix could see the American forces pinned down in a smaller compound 400 meters away, their return fire sporadic and desperate. This was why she'd spent 6 years learning to fly the Warthog, why she'd endured the jokes about the ugly aircraft that couldn't match the sleek fighters for speed or glamour. "Torch, I'm going in hot," Phoenix transmitted, rolling into her attack run with a wounded bird that responded like it was flying through molasses. "Keep those SAMs off my back." The targeting pipper in her heads-up display settled over the enemy positions as she lined up for what might be her final gun run. At this range, with a damaged aircraft and fuel running critically low, there wouldn't be time for a second pass. She would have to make this one count, deliver every round with precision that separated professional aviators from weekend warriors. The trigger felt familiar under her finger as Phoenix squeezed off a burst that sent 30mm shells screaming downrange at nearly 3 times the speed of sound. The GAU-8 cannon spoke with a voice like thunder, its distinctive BRRRT sound echoing off the mountains as Phoenix walked her fire across the enemy positions. 30mm shells designed to destroy Soviet tanks made short work of mud brick walls and fighting positions, each impact sending up clouds of dust and debris that obscured the battlefield like a localized sandstorm. Through her targeting display, Phoenix watched enemy fighters scatter from positions they'd held for hours, their courage evaporating under the withering fire from above. "Direct hits, Phoenix," came the voice of the forward air controller with the ground forces, his excitement crackling through the radio static. "Enemy forces are withdrawing, repeat, withdrawing from all positions. Outstanding work up there." But Phoenix barely heard the praise, focused instead on nursing her dying aircraft through a combat turn that required every ounce of skill she'd accumulated over 6 years and 3 combat deployments. Her right engine was overheating badly now, temperature gauges creeping into the red zone that meant catastrophic failure was measured in minutes rather than hours. The control stick felt sluggish in her hands, requiring constant input to keep the aircraft flying straight and level. Every warning light on her instrument panel seemed to be illuminated, painting the cockpit in shades of amber and red that told the story of an aircraft pushed far beyond its design limits. "Phoenix, you need to get that bird on the ground," Torch advised from his orbiting F-16, his voice carrying the professional concern of one pilot for another. "I can see smoke trailing from your right engine. That thing's about to cook itself." Phoenix knew he was right, could feel the vibrations through her seat that meant moving parts were coming apart inside her turbine. The question wasn't whether her engine would fail, but whether she could find somewhere safe to land before it happened. Below, the rescued American forces were already moving toward their extraction point, their ordeal over thanks to the intervention of a pilot who refused to abandon her mission, even when her aircraft was falling apart around her. But Phoenix's war was far from finished. She still had to find a way to get her wounded Warthog back to friendly territory, still had to prove that the legends about her call sign weren't exaggerated after all. The radio crackled with coordinates for an emergency landing strip, but it was 40 miles away across terrain that would challenge even a healthy aircraft. Phoenix pointed her nose toward home and hoped her engine would hold together for one more miracle. The fuel gauge was showing fumes now, the engine temperature was climbing toward shutdown parameters, and her hydraulic pressure was non-existent. By every regulation in the book, she should have ejected 10 minutes ago. But ejection meant abandoning a multi-million-dollar aircraft in enemy territory, and more importantly, it meant accepting defeat from circumstances that hadn't killed her yet. Control, Phoenix inbound to emergency strip Charlie, declare emergency aircraft, she transmitted, her voice calm despite the desperate situation developing in her cockpit. Single engine, minimal fuel, multiple system failures. Request emergency vehicles standing by. The response came back immediately. Crash trucks were rolling, medical teams were mobilizing, and every available pilot was monitoring her frequency in case she needed to talk through emergency procedures. The landscape below shifted from the harsh browns of the combat zone to slightly more hospitable terrain that suggested civilization might exist somewhere beyond the horizon. Phoenix nursed her throttle setting like a cardiac patient managing their heart rate, keeping power just high enough to maintain level flight, while hopping she wasn't demanding more than her dying engine could provide. Every few minutes, new warning tones would sound in her cockpit, adding their voices to the symphony of systems on the edge of failure. "Phoenix, how you doing up there?" Torch's voice carried genuine concern as he maintained his escort position off her right wing, ready to call and rescue assets if her situation deteriorated further. "Your smoke trail's getting thicker. Maybe we should start looking for alternative landing sites." "Negative, Torch," Phoenix replied, her eyes fixed on the coordinates displayed on her navigation system. "We've come this far on one engine and a prayer. Might as well see if faith can get us the rest of the way home." She didn't mention that her faith was running as low as her fuel, or that she could feel control authority bleeding away as her damaged aircraft fought her inputs with increasing stubbornness. Ahead, barely visible through the heat shimmer rising from the desert floor, she could make out the geometric lines that meant human construction. The emergency airstrip was still 15 miles away, but for the first time in an hour, Phoenix allowed herself to believe she might actually make it. The final approach to emergency strip, Charlie required flying an aircraft that had officially become unflyable, nursing systems that had exceeded their operational limits by margins that would make engineers weep. Phoenix's right engine was running on willpower and luck, producing just enough thrust to keep her airborne while threatening to seize completely at any moment. Her fuel quantity was listed as unknown on the gauge, which in aviation terminology meant she was flying on vapors and hope. "Emergency strip Charlie, Phoenix on final approach, single engine emergency," she called on the tower frequency, her voice steady despite the chaos surrounding her in the cockpit. "Request straighten approach, no pattern work. I'm not sure this bird has enough left for a go-around." The response came back immediately. Runway was cleared, emergency vehicles were in position, and she was cleared to land on any piece of concrete that looked suitable. Through her cracked canopy, Phoenix could see the crashed trucks lined up like red sentinels along the runway edge, their flashing lights painting the tarmac in urgent colors. Paramedics and flight surgeons waited with equipment she hoped she wouldn't need, while maintenance crews stood ready to assess whatever remained of her aircraft after landing. The sight should have been comforting, but all it really meant was that everyone expected this landing to end badly. Her approach speed was higher than normal, necessitated by the loss of flaps and the unpredictable handling characteristics of her damaged Warthog. The desert floor rushed past at what felt like breakneck speed, the concrete runway growing larger in her windscreen with each passing second. Phoenix could feel her aircraft wanting to roll left constantly, requiring steady pressure on the stick to maintain runway alignment. This landing would require every technique she'd learned in 6 years of flying A-10s, plus a few innovations that weren't covered in any manual. "Phoenix, you're looking good. Maintain current approach," came the voice of the tower controller, professional calm masking what must have been considerable concern for the pilot attempting to land a shot-up aircraft on his runway. "Wind is light and variable. Runway is yours." Phoenix acknowledged with a click of her microphone button, not trusting her voice to remain steady as she committed to an approach that would either end in triumph or disaster. The main landing gear touched down with a jarring impact that sent vibrations through the entire airframe, but the massive tires held, and the aircraft stayed centered on the runway centerline. Phoenix deployed her drag chute and applied what little braking power remained in her system, feeling the wounded Warthog gradually slow from landing speed to a fast taxi, then finally to walking pace as momentum bled away in the desert heat. When her aircraft finally rolled to a stop, Phoenix sat motionless in her ejection seat for nearly a minute, listening to the blessed silence that meant she was alive, on the ground, and safe. Outside her canopy, she could see crash crews approaching cautiously, their faces reflecting amazement that both pilot and aircraft had survived an ordeal that should have ended in catastrophe hours earlier. She reached up and shut down her remaining engine, watching the instruments wind down to zero as her war-weary Warthog finally got the rest it had earned through blood and determination. "Torch, Phoenix is down safe," she transmitted on their tactical frequency, her voice carrying emotion she couldn't quite name. "Thanks for keeping me company on the way home." The response came back immediately, filled with relief and respect that spoke to the bond between pilots who shared the risks and rewards of military aviation. Phoenix began the shutdown checklist, her hands moving through familiar procedures while her mind processed what she'd just survived. Around her aircraft, maintenance personnel were already beginning their assessment of damage that should have been impossible to survive. Holes in her fuselage marked where shrapnel had come within inches of vital systems. Her left engine was completely destroyed, its internal components scattered across several square miles of Afghan mountainside. Her right engine would need complete replacement after the abuse it had endured keeping her airborne for the past 2 hours. But she was alive, her mission was complete, and 12 American soldiers would be going home to their families because she'd refused to quit when quitting was the logical choice. As Phoenix finally climbed down from her cockpit, she could see the respect in the eyes of everyone watching. This was how legends were born in the aviation community, through actions that defied explanation and pilots who refused to accept the impossible as final. The debriefing would come later, followed by the inevitable paperwork and official reports that reduced extraordinary events to clinical language and statistical data. But for now, Phoenix stood next to her damaged aircraft and allowed herself a moment to appreciate the simple fact that she was still breathing, still walking, still alive to fly another day. The desert wind carried the scent of jet fuel and hot metal, the familiar smells of military aviation that had defined her adult life. In the distance, she could hear the rotors of incoming helicopters bringing the rescued ground forces back to safety. Their mission successful thanks to close air support, delivered by a pilot who'd learned to find miracles in machinery that everyone else had written off as hopeless. The official after-action report would be filed by Lieutenant Colonel Webb 3 days later, its clinical language failing to capture the full scope of what had occurred in the skis over Afghanistan. Major Thorne demonstrated exceptional airmanship and tactical judgment while operating a severely damaged aircraft in combat conditions. The report stated, reducing 2 hours of impossible flying to bureaucratic prose that would be read by people who'd never felt a control stick in their hands. But the unofficial stories spread through the aviation community like wildfire, growing with each retelling as pilots tried to make sense of what Phoenix had accomplished. How did you explain flying an A-10 with one engine, no hydraulics, and fuel that should have run out 30 minutes before landing? How did you quantify the kind of skill that turned a certain disaster into a textbook example of emergency procedures and tactical excellence? "She's always been different," Captain Morrison told anyone who would listen, his voice carrying the awe of someone who'd witnessed something extraordinary from a front row seat. But what she did out there, that wasn't just good flying. That was something else entirely. The other pilots nodded in understanding, recognizing the kind of performance that separated true aviators from people who merely operated aircraft. Phoenix herself remained characteristically quiet about her experience, deflecting praise with the professional modesty that marked serious military pilots. "I just did what the situation required," she told the intelligence debriefers, her matter-of-fact tone suggesting that single-engine landings in combat zones were routine occurrences. "The A-10 is built to take punishment and keep flying. I just helped it live up to its design specifications." But privately, in the quiet hours before dawn when sleep proved elusive, Phoenix replayed every moment of those 2 hours in her mind. She remembered the feeling of flying an aircraft that should have been falling apart, the sensation of making split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death for soldiers she'd never met. Most clearly, she remembered the absolute certainty that failure wasn't an option, that 12 American lives depended on her ability to accomplish the impossible with a machine that had already given everything it had to give. The maintenance report on her aircraft read like a catalog of catastrophic failures that should have made flight impossible. Multiple structural damage points, complete loss of left power plant, hydraulic system failure, flight control degradation, fuel system compromise. Yet somehow, Phoenix had coaxed 90 more minutes of flight time from systems that existed in various states of destruction, proving once again that the human element remained the most important component of any aircraft. Her call sign had been earned years earlier, but this mission would cement its meaning in aviation lore for decades to come. The Silver Star ceremony took place 6 weeks later on a pristine parade ground that bore no resemblance to the harsh landscape, where Phoenix had earned her decoration. Dress blue uniforms and polished shoes replaced flight suits and combat boots, while dignitaries who'd never heard a shot fired in anger delivered speeches about heroism and duty to an audience that understood both concepts intimately. Phoenix stood at attention while the citation was read, her face professionally neutral as the official language attempted to capture extraordinary events in ordinary words. For gallantry in action while engaged in military operations involving conflict with an armed hostile force, the narrator intoned, his voice carrying across the assembled ranks of military personnel who recognized the magnitude of what their colleague had accomplished. But the real recognition came from her fellow pilots, the men and women who understood what it meant to fly damaged aircraft through hostile territory while responsible for the lives of people depending on their skill and determination. Their applause was genuine, born from professional respect for someone who'd pushed the boundaries of what was possible and returned to tell about it. "I've been flying for 22 years, Colonel Matthews told the assembled media after the ceremony, his weathered face reflecting decades of military aviation experience. "I've seen remarkable pilots accomplish remarkable things, but what Major Thorne did that day, that was something I'm not sure I could have pulled off, and I'm not sure many other pilots could have either. She didn't just save her own life or even just complete her mission. She redefined what we thought was possible in an A-10 Thunderbolt." The aircraft itself had been retired after the mission, its airframe declared structurally unsound after the abuse it had endured over Afghanistan. But pictures of the damaged Warthog began appearing in squadron-ready rooms across the Air Force, visual reminders of what could be accomplished when skill met determination under impossible circumstances. Young pilots studied the images of twisted metal and battle damage, trying to understand how anyone had managed to fly such a machine home safely. Phoenix returned to operational flying within a month, transitioning to newer aircraft with updated systems and capabilities that seemed almost luxurious compared to the shot-up A-10 she'd nursed through her career-defining mission. But she carried with her the knowledge that when everything went wrong simultaneously, when all the systems failed and the situation looked hopeless, the human element could still find a way to accomplish the mission. Her reputation preceded her now wherever she was assigned, bringing both opportunities for advancement and the burden of living up to a legend that grew larger with each retelling. But Phoenix had never flown for recognition or career advancement. She'd flown because someone had to be ready when impossible missions needed to be completed by people who refused to accept defeat as inevitable. The war in Afghanistan would eventually end, marked by ceremonies and speeches that attempted to summarize a conflict too complex for simple narratives. Thousands of military personnel would return home with their own stories of service and sacrifice, their experiences forming the foundation for whatever came next in their lives. But for the aviation community, certain missions would be remembered as benchmarks of what was possible when training met crisis under combat conditions. Phoenix's emergency landing and subsequent takeoff would be studied in flight schools for years to come, dissected by instructors trying to identify the decision-making processes that enabled success under impossible circumstances. The technical aspects could be analyzed and taught, but the intangible qualities that separated exceptional pilots from competent ones remained mysterious, visible only in the results they achieved when everything went wrong simultaneously. 20 years later, Phoenix would retire as a general officer, her career spanning multiple conflicts and technological advances that transformed military aviation beyond recognition. But when young pilots asked her to describe her most challenging mission, she would always return to that afternoon over Afghanistan when she learned that aircraft were only as limited as the people flying them, and that impossible was often just another word for difficult. The A-10 Thunderbolt II remained in service long after experts predicted its retirement, its unique capabilities ensuring continued relevance in conflicts that demanded close air support delivered with precision and persistence. Pilots flying the aircraft decades after Phoenix's emergency landing would hear her story during their initial training, understanding that they were inheriting not just a machine, but a legacy of excellence that demanded nothing less than their absolute best effort regardless of circumstances. In squadron bars around the world, when conversation turned to remarkable flying and impossible missions accomplished against overwhelming odds, someone would inevitably mention the pilot who took off with a shot-up A-10 to save American lives, then flew it home on one engine and pure determination. The details might vary with each telling, but the essential truth remained constant. Some people rise to meet extraordinary circumstances, and their actions become the standard by which others measure professional excellence. Phoenix never considered herself heroic, maintaining throughout her career that she'd simply done what the situation required with the tools available to her. But heroism, like excellence, is often defined not by the person demonstrating it, but by those who witness it and recognize something extraordinary in what might seem like routine professional competence to the individual involved. The desert wind still blows across that emergency landing strip in Afghanistan, now returned to the local population as American forces withdrew, and conflicts evolved into different shapes with different requirements. But the memory of what occurred there remains vivid in the minds of everyone who participated, witnessed, or heard the story of a pilot who refused to quit when quitting was the reasonable choice. Major Cassandra Thorne had earned her call sign through years of professional competence and tactical excellence, but on that September afternoon, she transcended even her own reputation to accomplish something that would be remembered as long as military pilots gathered to share stories of the impossible made routine through skill, courage, and absolute refusal to accept failure as inevitable. The sky over Afghanistan had witnessed many remarkable events during years of conflict, but few would resonate through aviation history like the day Phoenix rose from the ashes of what should have been certain disaster to prove once again that the human spirit, properly trained and absolutely committed, remained the most powerful force in military aviation.